Welcome, everyone. It is our Lenten pilgrimage. This is the Baptismal Covenant. We're doing 5 weeks, 5 vows. There are 5 practical or practicing questions in the Baptismal Covenant that we've been following along with, as opposed to the 3 creedal statements, which we covered another time. And the idea behind this is that each one of these promises, each one of these vows that we make with our Baptismal Covenant, and then reaffirm when we do baptisms in the church, the core of that is to get us to a place where we're able to sort of click in and really be connected to what it means to be following Jesus, but also practicing our our baptism. Like, it's something we actually work at. It doesn't just exist. It's a part of being a community. It's part of being engaged with people. And so this particular question today, as much as the other ones have been challenging, I think this is one of the ones when I talk to people about what it means to be Christian as opposed to other faiths. And by Christian, I mean a follower of Jesus. So whatever denomination we're talking about, whether that's Roman Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Byzantine Orthodox, Byzantine Catholic, Armenian Orthodox, anybody who professes a belief in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, categorized as Christian. Any of those denominations we're talking about, people who commit to following Jesus, we try and attempt to live by what he taught. And that's great until you start thinking about what he taught. In that he was a very faithful and very passionate practicer of the law of Moses, the Torah. There were about 613 laws, specific on the books laws, not just 10 commandments, but over 600. I know you keep that in your pocket, right? 600. And the idea behind these commandments was that God was going to love us, and our response to God's love, to love God back, is to take on the practice. I had a patient once. I was a chaplain in a hospital, and I keep going back to this guy. He was a great guy. He was a rabbi by training, but he worked in the gem trade in Manhattan, and he was a cancer patient at this hospital. And I walked in one day, and he was just not happy. Like, just that kind of sourpuss, face drawn down, and a tray of hospital food was in front of him. Surprise, And he goes, I'm really disappointed that the kosher food in this hospital is so bad. I go, why is it bad? He goes, it's just salty. Like, and I go, well, if you don't mind my asking, why do you keep kashrut? Why do you keep kosher? And he says, and he looks at me like, not so much gobsmacked, but just sort of like, no one's ever really asked that question in that way before, candidly. He says, because I love God. My response for God loving me is for me to love God back with obedience. So I keep these rules, these practices, these relationships in order that I can demonstrate to God my love. And then there's a reciprocity in that. Now, what Jesus comes to us, and we're going to talk about this as we engage this particular question that I'm about to share with you. What Jesus challenges us with is not so much to dispel it, to end it, but instead, and this is important, fulfill it. So the way I describe it is, rather than thinking about 613 rules that you have to keep so that you're staring up at the ceiling and you have to have a degree to follow it, rather think of it this way: there are 2, but the 2 cover all the rest. And what that means is that our call as followers of Jesus is not so much to live within covenanted relationship of keeping rules, but instead profoundly in keeping relationship. In other words, Jesus isn't getting rid of the bar, Jesus is raising it. And that's the great challenge for us as we engage in this conversation of the next big question, which is, will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? Now, I will with God's help is the response, but one of those things, did anybody ever have one of those WWJD bracelets? Or a mug, or a bumper sticker? Have you seen those, right? What would Jesus do? The other one is I keep a common rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. All of that's transactional, right? What the interesting about this is it's not transactional. Will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbors yourself? The very core of that is to understand that I understand that there is a Christ, a spark of the divine in every person. And it is incumbent upon me to seek that out and to be in relationship with it, the other person. And that other person is Christ-like or is Christ to me. And then that means that I have to love my neighbor as myself. And that's great if you are okay with loving yourself. That can be a challenge, right? We all know that. The other side is living where we do in New Jersey and pretty much anywhere else in the Western world where neighbors are really close and sometimes too close for comfort. Loving our neighbors as ourselves can be a distinct and profound challenge because there's an awful lot of abrasion, of real heavy friction in our lives by ourselves alone, much less with other people. My mentor, one of my mentors, who was the priest who sponsored me for ordination. He and I are actually still in a relationship. He now lives in Springfield, New Jersey. He is actually, you wouldn't know this, but he's actually an honorary associate here because he's not a resident clergy person. He's licensed, which is semantics. If you want to hear about this sometime, ask me about it. It's not for tonight. But every clergy person is canonically resident in a diocese, whereas a parishioner is resident in a parish. So I'm part of this diocese of New Jersey. That's where my hat is. And his hat, where he retired from, is Pennsylvania. But he lives in New Jersey, so he's licensed to be here by the bishop. And he needs to be under the wing of a rector, me, I'm resident. But anyway, I went into his office one day and he had been having a really bad day as a rector. So the toilets were broken, people were being mean to him, all this stuff. And he goes, the church would be a great place without all these people in it. And it made me guffaw. First off, it shocked me because, who wants to hear their priest say that? But the other side, it's kind of true. It's like the world would be a great place if it weren't for all these people, right? ShopRite would be a great place if it weren't for all these people. My life would be a great place if it weren't for all these people. But then if there are no people, there's no life. So it's kind of one of these tensions we're in. There's this great person who actually literally wrote the book on monasticism. His name is Saint Benedict. And one of his greatest contributions to Christianity is what you see there, and it's actually inscribed in German by the door of this monastery. Let all guests who arrive be received as Christ. So every person who walks, hey, Michelle, I do know. Why not? Slide it. Every person who arrives at a religious community is we're not saying, oh, it's so nice you're here, Michelle, glad you're here. It's, oh, Jesus, you showed up. How would you react if you're kind of hanging out and there's a knock on the door, and you open the door and there's Jesus. Hi, I was just passing by. And you're like, you don't have pamphlets, do you? How would you react if it was actually Jesus? It's challenging, isn't it, to be confronted in this way? So this context of understanding ourselves as being in relationship to each other. I was trying to find a good image of a Jesus that we could all sort of find apprehendable and acceptable. And I love this one. This is by a Central American artist, Seeing Christ in All Persons. And there are two ways to understand this. One is the way St. Paul strives to get us to understand that. And that is, we are called to be imitators of Christ. There are several great Renaissance writers spoke about the imitatio Christi, or imitatio Dei, be an imitator of God. We're not Christ, but we can get as close to that as we can. So to be Christ adjacent, that's one thing. The other piece is understand that we are actually possessing the spark of the divine in us. That God, when God made humanity, God breathed into, I know it sounds weird, God breathed into our nostril and we became living souls. We became living beings. And by living beings, we mean sentient, thinking, reflecting, understanding the day has a beginning, middle, and an end. There's a tomorrow, there's a yesterday, there's a beginning of our lives, and there's an end to it. This is more causes more pondering than most things in the animal phyla do in the rest of creation. So within the context of carrying that imago Dei, that image of God, then each one of us reflects or refracts that divine light. And if that's true, then every person we lock eyes with, every person we encounter, every person who sees and experiences us is experiencing Christ. So will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? That's the great challenge. And now here's the big question. Do you guys find that easy or hard, give or take? I find it extraordinarily difficult. I'll admit it. I've been a follower of Jesus since I was baptized at 4 months old at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Lansing, Michigan. And I wasn't even sentient at that point, but that my parents thought it would be a good idea. And I grew up Episcopalian. I've been a priest for 30 years of my 58 on this planet. I'm still trying to figure out what it means to be a faithful and good Christian. Because when this question comes up, will you love your neighbor as yourself? I've known some good neighbors and some bad neighbors. And I was just talking with someone I was having a pastoral conversation with, that one of the greatest challenges I had once from a counselor of mine who challenged me, he said, are you willing to forgive? And just like Peter did with Jesus, how often? And he said, all the time. I was trying to overcome a particular trauma in my ministry in my life. What is it like to be confronted with the fact that the priest who's guiding you through this challenges you to say, are you willing to forgive? Sure, I forgive them. Now do it again. I forgive them. Now do it again. I forgive them. Tomorrow morning when you wake up and you think of them, are you willing to forgive them then? And again and again and again. It becomes a very challenging practice. Again, loving our neighbors as ourselves, that's that great challenge. So the idea of seeing the Christ in all persons is also another thing. It's a willingness on our part to see Christ reflected back at us when we look in the mirror and when we sit inside with our own thoughts, when we're quietly by ourselves or when we're in the midst of a tumult. Are we willing to have the Christ within us be manifest as well? So you see, we Christ is greeting Christ in this. It becomes kind of a circular engagement. It's deeply challenging. And I'm going to try to frame that with some different ways. The first is the distinct and directive inquiry or directive to really seek the Christ in the other. The other piece of this is we're not seeking a Christ that's abstract, but rather one made known to us or revealed to us. So I'm looking at you, and it's Tuesday at 7:19, and now I have to discern the Christ in you. Roll up the sleeves, get to it. How do you do that? How do you actually engage in that practice? The other piece of this is that, and this came up in a conversation we were having around Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. She makes a reference to a very obscure philosopher and Jewish theologian not a lot of people are engaged with, called Martin Buber, Buber. And he wrote this amazing little book that rocked my world when I was a seminarian and continues to mess with me today. He wrote a book called I and Thou. The essential element of humanity, he says, is when we move from an I-it experience of the universe to an I and Thou experience of the universe. I-it is, I'm a living, thinking thing. It is a chair. Like it's but as if you've ever known a toddler and they close their eyes and make the world go away, you're not here because I can't see you. It's literally divesting the things out there in the universe that are not us of any meaning or import or sense of being. The obverse of that, the opposite of that is if we see all things as thou, if we perceive that creation is the very manifestation of the Creator's will to call all things into being continuously, down to the finest of subatomic particles, up to the absolute vast display of galaxies and stars in their courses in this massive, massive universe we call home. If we are willing to see the Creator manifested in all that, how can we look at a chair or a tree or our neighbor as anything less than the divine presence revealed? That was the word we used for the beloved. That was the word we used for the dear one. That was as a term of intimacy versus a term of alienation. So Buber challenges us to say that the other is right in front of us, and the other is thou. It's deeply challenging. And then it gets even more fine-tuned when we say, if we're willing to greet the other as thou, we acknowledge that that is an actual spiritual practice. It's a discipline. Like we don't just wake up in the morning and think to ourselves, we get up in the morning, look at the coffee maker and say, hello, thou coffee maker. I look forward to spending time with you as a manifestation of the divine love for all creation. And then the cat or the dog yammers in your ear, and you think to yourself, hello, dog, beloved cat, beloved thing of all creation. I look forward to spending time, and then rack it up until that person tries to turn left in front of you when you're trying to get to work. And it's all over, and it's game on. And we cease to use the hi, thou words, and the words start to have F in front of them. Unless, of course, you give it up for Lent.
Well, that's it. When you have the right mindset, you're good, and you can treat people really well. But when your mindset...
So, and that's one of the great challenges. So the image that I chose to sort of manifest this and how we need to approach it as a discipline is that there was a prophet named Elisha. Now there's Elijah and there was Elisha. And Elisha was the student, the apprentice of Elijah the prophet, and took on his gifts and his responsibilities. At one point, Elisha the prophet is confronted with a woman who has nothing. She's a widow, and she's been receiving support from the community. Unfortunately, there's not enough. And all she has to make her living is one jar of oil. And the prophet looks at that and says, well, that's not any good. So he commands a whole bunch of vessels to be brought to them, and he begins to pour oil out of the jar. And the oil doesn't run out, and it keeps filling all the jars, and she's able to sell all the oil in those jars and make money and keep her family. Isn't that great? It's more than just a snap your fingers miracle. What it is that Elisha saw that this woman was literally unable to make her way in the world. She had no husband or son to protect her, so she was left to her own devices. And most of the devices left to widows in those days were either abject poverty, begging, or to sell their bodies. And she had one jar of oil to make a living from to avoid those two outcomes. And so with this gift of honoring her humanity, then she was able to do that. This is not seeing the Christ in her because this is a Hebrew scripture story, but you get the point. Becomes an aspect of practice. How do we extend ourselves to the other? How do you tender that care? Someone asked, what is a good neighbor besides State Farm? So there's some biblical images to consider here. One, I think you recognize, right? Can anybody tell what this image is of? It's Van Gogh who did this, actually. I'm sorry, I take it back. It's a painting Van Gogh copies. Delacroix. Does anybody know this Bible story? Can you make a guess?
Well, this is the one where somebody was hurt by the side of the road.
Yes.
By him and left him there.
Exactly.
After the Samaritan picked him up.
Good Samaritan. So we see the Good Samaritan being a Good Samaritan. Right? So that's one of them. So the parable of the Good Samaritan is a great answer to the question of who is my neighbor. But it's a complex answer because it just doesn't involve, there's a guy in the ditch and I'm going to help him out.
But in that story though, didn't a bishop or a holy man walk by him too, or
Oh,
something?
you're going to call us all out, huh?
I was studying the story last week in my own
Yeah.
personal Bible study, and a holy man walked right by him and didn't want it.
So a Levite, a person who is, the problem with, there's a problem with the man in the ditch. And this is a great image for who is my neighbor. The man in the ditch has been beset upon by robbers, beaten, and left lifeless in a ditch. In other words, he's lying there in a ditch, and you can't tell whether he's alive or dead. So 3 people walk by. A priest walks by and doesn't touch him. Why? Because the priest is a consecrated person. If he touches a dead body or if he touches blood, he is polluted, and then he can't do his job. A Levite passes by, and it's kind of the same thing. Now, the Levite isn't necessarily a priest under direct authority, but as a person who is versed and conversant to the law, to touch blood, to touch a body is polluting. So they keep walking by. And then a Samaritan comes by, and Samaritans were denigrated. They were considered other. It's, right? Not thous. And he's the one who gets off of his mule, gets down to the ditch to see if he's dead or not, helps the person because he's not dead, binds his wounds, cleans him up, takes him to an inn, gives him things, goes over the top. I mean, really, takes him to the Holiday Inn Express, make sure he has fresh towels. It's more than just a simple gesture. It's something deeply and profoundly challenging. And in this context, what it does is it places an onus on the others to have not seen the humanity. Now we see that, we're like, well, they should have stopped to help. And in fact, there are laws now called Good Samaritan laws that both adjure people when someone's in distress to help them. And if they walk away, they could be in trouble. And also basically indemnify them if they stop to help and then the person being helped decides to sue them later on. They have protections, Good Samaritan protections. It's kind of entered into our nomenclature. But the idea behind this is that the Samaritan was a good neighbor. The guy in the ditch needed a neighbor. And the boundaries and barriers which had been erected between them because of rules that taught them to walk away rather than to engage were being addressed. And throughout Jesus's teaching, he stresses over and over and over again when he does healings on the Sabbath, that it's better to heal on the Sabbath than to do no work. It's better to save a life on the Sabbath than to see someone lose their life because you couldn't literally lift a finger. Because you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, because God told us not to work on the Sabbath. There are rules. Keep the rules because we love God. But if we love God, this is where you see the conundrum, but if we love God, that means we love the creation, right? And if we love the creation, if we see somebody in trouble on the Sabbath day and we don't help them, that puts us on the horns of a dilemma, doesn't it? So the challenge with the Good Samaritan story is to understand that what Jesus is doing is that he's taking the law itself and he's showing it to us as not a bad thing, not something to throw away, but actually something to know very well, and then to understand when we transgress, why we do it and to what end. We choose life, we choose to help. The Good Samaritan was not faithless by touching what might have been a dead body or by engaging in touching his blood, his life substance, and helping him dress his wounds. But he made a decision that it was worth it to risk that, render aid. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
The other one is a great one. There's this guy Elijah. I talked about Elijah a minute ago. There's this guy Elijah. Elijah is fleeing from King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. And he winds up in this little town of Zarephath, where there is a famine in the land. Nobody has any food. And he's sitting there in the main square, and this widow comes by, and she's got this little bag of barley meal and this little jar of oil. And she's walking home. And he goes, "Hey, lady, I'm new in town. Would you make me a cake from that oil and that barley meal?" And she goes, "Are you kidding me? There's a famine. this is the very last of my money, and with it I bought the last of the food in town. And I'm going home, and this she actually says this, I'm going home to make a cake for my son and I, and then we're going to die. Have a nice day. And he says, well, that's not any good. If you make a cake for me, I will say a prayer, and basically the oil and the meal don't run out through the entire expanse of the famine. And Elijah goes and lives with her, and basically they become a unit, a family. But it's all about how one thing is set up, and then the challenge to see the humanity of the other is expressed. The woman can't fulfill the laws of hospitality because everybody's starving. She has nothing to offer if she gives the stranger food, which she is bound to do by the rules of hospitality. And yet, at the same time, he, taking the last food from her, would be responsible for her death. So how do you figure out what the right thing to do in that situation is? The good news is, the prophet stepped up and did a miracle. The bad news is that it continues to test us and test God. Because it wasn't long after this famine came to an end that the son gets sick and dies. And the Zarephath woman, widow, goes, really? You saved us through this entire famine, and now my son is dead. Elijah takes the boy up into the upper room and prays like the dickens to God and raises the boy and hands it back to its mother. So powerful is this story that it's mirrored again in the story of Jesus going to the little girl and saying, little girl, get up. And then again in the Acts of the Apostles, when Peter is confronted with a woman named Dorcas who's passed away, who was a prominent woman of the church in the place where he was visiting. And they say, can you do anything for her? And he's like, in Aramaic, little girl get up is Talitha kum. In Greek, the woman's name was Dorcas. In Aramaic, it was Tabitha. So he says to her, Tabitha, get up. And she did. So the idea here is that when we are willing to engage and see the other as one who is beloved of God, of thou, then we start to understand that this practice of loving our neighbors as ourselves is really not so much about being nice to my neighbor down the street because one should do that. I'm actively seeking Christ and seeing Christ in that person. It'd be challenging. This is where I started with this. So Jesus is confronting us with a summary of the law. One of the things that's interesting is that he's confronted a couple times in the Gospels, in Matthew and Mark and Luke, and asked which of the commandments is the most important. Now, I'm not asking you to know all 613. One of those, by the way, is, Peter, if your donkey falls in my well, you're responsible for cleaning up the well, but I'm responsible for the price of the donkey. Just to keep things fair, right? I know you're going to be able to sleep well tonight without one. But also don't mix milk and meat. Don't eat things that are scavengers. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other things, the dietary laws, all kinds of restrictions. But what Jesus says is basically the most important commandment is this: love God with your whole being, your whole substance, everything you've got. Love God and love your neighbor. These two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Every law that exists on the books, if you will, in Torah, everything every prophet says throughout the Hebrew scriptures is hung on one of those two posts behind the door where our coats go. One is God and God, love of God, and the other one is love of neighbor. And actually, it's interesting, when you come into church on Sunday and we recite the Decalogue, God says, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods but me. Do not make any graven image of me. Do not worship anything other than God, right? And remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. That's about God relationship. That's 3. The other 7 are about how we relate to each other. Don't murder, don't lie, don't bear false witness, don't covet, don't commit adultery. Don't do things that relate in the cost of a human relationship's validity. So when Jesus says the summary of the law, he's really being very succinct and saying, this is who we are. And it's cogent to this. Most of Torah relates how we would treat our neighbors over and against what we're supposed to be doing in relationship to God. Any questions on that? It can be a little snarky because it sounds like Jesus is kind of, dispelling things, sweeping things off the table. Like I said, in many ways, it's raising the bar. If you want to take, for instance, and I'm going to go back a couple of years when we had the first wave of refugees from Syria, a lot of people got upset about that because, who are these people to come in to this country? Well, they're our neighbors. And it can even get more dicey because in Leviticus, everybody uses Leviticus to say bad things about people, but Leviticus, there are various explicit parts of the law that says not only are you expected to care for the alien in the land, but to make sure that they are well cared for and lifted up. Somebody's just passing through, make sure they're cared for. And that's more than just telling them where to get good pizza. Right? There's a deeper onus of hospitality, which goes back to what I was saying about Benedict of Nursia. Everyone who comes through this door is Christ's child. And it alters our perception of how we perceive the other. It doesn't necessarily make them good or bad. It doesn't, if somebody treats us wrong, it doesn't mean that we have to just say, well, that's lovely, thank you, please more. What it means is that there's a higher code of understanding the other that we're called to. And figuring out how that works is what we're going to spend the rest of our lives trying to figure out and parse. So I showed you the Delacroix painting. Van Gogh, and this is one of those paintings that I love hearing the story of. So at the time Van Gogh was painting this particular painting, he is the worst neighbor ever. I mean, really bad. He is not the guy you want living next to you or in the street over or in town. This is not somebody you across at Dunkin' or at the bank. You do not want to meet him. He is the crazy guy who can't function in public appropriately. He is way off the rails. And people are avoiding him and they're trying to get him to leave town. The only person who can manage him is his brother at this point. He's at a full psychotic breakdown. And he's struggling with his mental illness. And one of the things you can see in this painting as he's trying to mimic Delacroix in that first one I showed you, you see him really struggling to do everything he can to copy the painting. But you can also see how distorted his perception is, his awareness of color and texture. I mean, one of the things that I appreciate about Van Gogh's painting is that he is such an amazing compositionalist that every brushstroke has mass and meaning. If you've ever gone and seen the sunflowers or things like that up close, the layers of paint, the nuances and twists of color in a single brushstroke as he brings one color and another together distinctly and to make a texture is just astounding. But at the same time, it also depicts pain. Because when I look at this picture, I not only see the story of the painting itself, but I also see the torture that the Samaritan who's trying to help the guy who's fallen into the ditch. The guy who's fallen into the ditch is not being helpful, being helped in that painting. I mean, he's contorted, he's twisted, he's falling off the horse as much as he's getting onto it. And at the same time, look at how the guy who's trying to help him is completely under duress. I mean, his shoes are falling off, his clothing's askew. Basically his face is buried in the guy's armpit as he's trying to render assistance and aid. His brother, Van Gogh's brother, was the only person who could really help him at that point in his life, in his illness. And even their relationship was alienated. So what I love about this is that you see the torture of a soul who's struggling to connect with people who don't want to connect with him. And he can barely hold on to himself. How do we do this incredible, challenging work of loving our neighbors as ourselves and loving ourselves when we can kiss this kind of duress all the time? The parable of the Good Samaritan is one way to approach it. We can look at this. There are other ways we can take this on. So I'm going to give you some scripture to go home and check out. Paul wrote this amazing letter to the Romans. It is both a very thick read and difficult to take on because it is full of guidance and information and counsel on his part. And at the same time, it can be infuriating because you really want him to make it a little more clear and a little more concise, and it never quite gets there until you get to the 12th and the 13th chapter. The 12th chapter is all about what it means to be a Christian, a follower of Jesus in community. And the passage begins with this: do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. Love one another, outdo one another in showing kindness. And I love this one: love your enemies, for it will heap burning coals on their head. He does slip a little, even at his best, Paul slips a little bit. But the idea behind this is that the kindness that we're being asked to exercise towards our neighbor and towards ourselves is actually a discipline. It's something that we have to work at. It's muscles we need to exercise. It's talents we need to develop and nurture. We need good teachers. We need good guides. And Romans 12, a New Testament professor of mine, he says, if you're looking for what it means for us to be called upon to be people who follow Jesus and show it. So do it and show it. He says Romans 12 is probably the best blueprint for a public faith fully engaged we can find. And then he turns around, Paul does, and in the next chapter, in 13, he says, and on top of that, I want you to figure out how to live in society with each other. So it's one thing to deal with my neighbor, right? I love Tom and Carol. They live right next door to us. They're great people. But we're not friends. We're neighbors. And there's a discipline to that, right? We're helpful to each other. We do our best for each other. But there's also a boundary. This is where 13 comes in. Oh, no one anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. And then after that, he says, you know what time it is? It's time to wake up, to understand that we're here in this society, in this community, to live in relationship with each other. I know a lot of people who articulate the faith of spirituality where they say, I don't need church, I don't need a community, I just need me and God. But if you're not with other people, how can you know God? Because you're just with yourself. When there's no us, when there's no one around you, you're just isolated. And even in that moment, how can you make a connection to the other if the other is an abstract, an idea in your head? We need somebody in front of us, even if it's just to go down to the Dunkin' and hang out with once in a while. Which gets us to some of the examples. If you're looking for a short book to read in the Bible, I love this one, The Letter to Philemon, or Philemon, depending on how you're feeling like you want to pronounce it. Philemon was this guy who was a member of Colossae. So when you see Paul's letter to the Colossians, he was one of the people that Paul was writing to. And in this single letter, it's literally only a page in the Bible. It's the shortest book of the Bible. Very succinct letter. Paul writes to Philemon, and he hands it to someone to hand to him. So it's a hand-delivered letter. And this is Paul at his snarkiest, because what he does is he hands this letter to Philemon to this man named Onesimus, who was a slave of Philemon's and run away from him, and followed Paul and served alongside him as a fellow worker for the kingdom. He supported the mission as Paul traveled around, and he was someone who experienced conversion and baptism. He became effectively an apostle alongside Paul and Barnabas and several others. And he is sent back to Colossae to hand this letter to Philemon. And you know what it says? My dearest brother Philemon, I am so happy to send to you my brother and your brother Onesimus. And I know you will receive him as your brother, because he is your brother and your neighbor. Not your property anymore. He's no one's property anymore. And what the tradition of the day was not just that a letter should be handed to somebody. Oh, Michelle, I have a letter for you. Here you go. And then Michelle takes the letter and looks at it and goes and reads it and then folds it and puts it in her pocket. No, it would be read to the whole church on Sunday in front of God and everybody. So there's Onesimus, there's Philemon, and there's the leader of the church who just read the letter. What happens next? We don't know. Because the letter ends with Paul saying, I look forward to coming to visit you soon.
I just want to ask you a question.
Sure.
I mean, I'm familiar with this, but did Onesimus run away from him for a reason, or did he just left him because he wanted to serve Paul?
He ran away. He
Did he do
explained
something wrong?
Explained Philemon. Oh yeah, when running away, he did something.
Okay, that's what I got. When I read it, I got the impression that he either stole from him or he did something wrong.
He
And
did steal from him. He
Oh,
stole
okay.
himself.
well, okay, but I mean, well, I didn't take that. I just grasped the stealing,
It's
but
a perfect example. He
Okay,
engaged, and
okay.
the Roman law that he was under
Okay,
would agree. He says, "You're right. Onesimus is a thief.
okay, all right,
He
that's what I
stole
got from it.
himself.
I see. Okay, well, I didn't get that part. Okay, I thought he stole.
He stole
like,
himself
money or
and ran
something.
away with
Okay,
it.
okay,
Himself."
okay,
And then when he came back, he would have been treated as a fugitive.
okay, that's, all right, that clears it up for me now. I just thought he was a robber and he was running.
Right. So Paul could have said, "Here's Onesimus, your property. Please be kind to him." He didn't mean to run away. And then Philemon could forgive him and he'd go back to the status quo. But he doesn't do that. He says, here is my son and your brother, basically. Everybody's very quiet in this. You know, how do you react to that? It's
I didn't know he was so snarky.
oh, Paul. Oh, Paul. Paul really needs to have another cup of coffee. Most days. Yeah. He can be very cranky.
I like it.
Yeah. And the worst thing about Paul, not only is he cranky, but he loves to write in Greek. And in Greek, there's no punctuation. So some of, like, we've done readings here in church on Sundays that are like a paragraph and a half long. It's one sentence. Very few.
Yeah, he's dangling participle, man.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So, but the aspect of this, taking this on, is that what does it mean to see someone who you don't see as human as being the other, your neighbor? Step away from dehumanization into humanization. It's a great challenge. So you're probably wondering, what are some examples we can find? So there was this Presbyterian minister who started this little public television show back in the day called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And I grew up with this as a child. And my sister, this was more her era, but he would come from out in the world singing this song, take off a blazer, put on a cardigan, take off his shoes, put on some Keds, and then there'd be a half-hour show of him talking very gently to us, the viewers, about what it means to be in community. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. It was lovely. Younger people may remember Barney and Friends. Same concept, different method of approaching this. It's like the idea that there's diversity in community. The idea that there are people that are helpers and people that are receivers, and that everybody has something to contribute. One of the things that was interesting is that at the very moment of Mr. Rogers sort of coming onto the scene and being broadcast for kids to watch, at that very moment, we were a very broken society. We were in the midst of the Vietnam War. We had experienced two dramatic assassinations with Bobby Kennedy and with Martin Luther King Jr. There had been an immense amount of unrest in the war because of the student protests on campuses. The levels of violence were very high, and there was a great deal of anxiety. On top of that, there were a lot of economic challenges, which meant that people were grading up against each other because there was a feeling there weren't enough resources. In the midst of this, in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, not only did everybody get along, but there was a black guy, there was a white guy, there was a Hispanic guy, there were ladies, there were men, you know, there were even little fuzzy puppets that, you know, struggled for meaning too. mean, there were all of these people who were continually trying to figure out what it meant to live in community. And Mr. Rogers spent time trying to figure out what that was. So much so that even memes today is like whenever there's a disaster, whenever there's a terrorist attack, what's one of the first memes that you see? It's this guy with his trolley who's saying, look for the helpers. If you're wondering what the good side of this is, look for the people who are running towards the calamity to help people. There's meaning in that. And I think that's one of the things I'll hold up to you. He was a Presbyterian minister who figured out that this was going to be his ministry for the rest of his life. And this is not a milquetoast guy as well. He was a soldier, he was a veteran. He had worked for a living, if you will. But at the same time, he also decided to embrace this gentle, leaning path. So what does that look like for us? Well, I was trying to think of something for St. Peter's to show you guys, and one of the ones I'll show you is this is last year's volunteer luncheon for the shop. So the shop at St. Peter's, if you haven't been there yet, you need to go and check it out. It's an amazing place. If you thrift, it is a place to thrift. You will find treasures. But on top of that, there's just an incredible community. And what I love about this particular picture is you see over 24 people, all of whom work at different levels of the shop in different ways, in different specialties and things they like to do and things they do because they know they need to get done. And all of them are trying to contribute. But they also see themselves as part of the community of St. Peter's, supporting its mission and ministry. Most of them you will never see in church. Some of them aren't Christian. They're Taoist, they're Buddhist, they're nothing. But because they see the ministry of life as we practice it here, according to Romans 12 and 13, let love be genuine, hate what is evil, strive to outdo one another in showing honor. Give to the other and with abandon, that they see themselves as part of that community. I was trying to describe our understanding of what it means to be a parish and what it means to seek and serve Christ in all persons and love our neighbors as ourselves. Like, what does it actually look like to practice that? And I said, you know what it is? It's like a pebble thrown into a lake. And you see concentric circles rippling outward from it in waves. And rather than thinking about St. Peter's as a place where people arrive to experience Christ in the church, near the altar, I think of the altar as the stone thrown into the water, with that impact then creating concentric circles, so that every circle knows it's connected to the source, but it's connected in a slightly different and expansive way. So even at the far reaches of where St. Peter's impacts, I love this. When Laura and I had a dog when we first arrived in South River, we were walking around Daly's Pond. And as we're walking around Daly's Pond, we encounter a lady who also is walking her dog. And we get to talking, and, oh, what do you do? I live here. We live there. Well, you just moved in? Yes. My wife goes, my husband's the Episcopal priest at St. Peter's in Spotswood. She goes, the thrift shop. I love that place. I take stuff there all the time. And I come home with stuff too. It's the idea here is that there's this collection of ministries that continually impact positively the community and that see the neighbor as someone to be treasured and honored. That's one of the things what it means when we say welcome home at St. Peter's, is to understand that we're not just saying that from the perspective of, oh, we're nice and we're glad to be here. Instead, it's a discipline we practice, which is we love them until they are us. Every person we meet that we aren't in a primary and profound relationship with yet is an opportunity for us to more fully know Christ. And then if we know Christ that way, we can make Christ known. I wanted to kind of give the background of some of the theological structure of that, but really, at the end of the day, if you just take away from this question is, will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? I will with God's help. If you just take away the practice of saying and practicing welcome home, wherever you are, then you're doing that. It's not complicated. Any thoughts as we tie off? Or questions or observations? Yes.
That's Rosita taking a selfie and she's smiling.
That is Rosita taking a selfie and she is no wait, that's me.
I was gonna say,
That's
that's,
you.
That's me.
Smile in the eyes. That's what, like,
I thought that was you.
That's me.
oh,
Actually, that's my cataract.
oh. And, like, that's just a great picture though. Like, you see the joy in your eye.
Absolutely.
Right.
I love my job.
But it's like you said, it's the community. Like, it's the sense of community. Because not everybody there works together at the same time.
Right.
Those people are there at different points during the week. So,
Exactly.
right.
We're all knit together by the mission, not by the. And you know, I thank you for that joy in the eye. If I come close at the end of my days and I have half of what he has in his eyes, I'll have made a success of my ministry in my life. But in that context, now you know what feeds us. Now you know what draws us together. It's it's as we take on these disciplines of following Jesus and practicing this faith are provocative because what they do is they provoke us not so much to feel shame or guilt, because I don't think that's a sustainable set of emotions, but instead is to realize that what we're being offered is forgiveness and inclusion, and also a profound and deep awareness that what it is and who we are and what we offer is deeply desired of God. Like Martin Huber, to tie it off with the I vow thing, is that his position is that God created the universe. It emanated from the divine nature. And when it became distinct, the divine nature looked on creation and adored it and desired to have it back, to be back in union with it, communion with it. And that action of drawing creation back in is what we experience as salvation history. So it's seeing the other and then drawing back into relationship. And that's what this is. Now, when we get to next week, we'll talk about what it means to strive for justice and peace and respect the dignity of every human being. So we go from, won't you be my neighbor, to how do we make, in the name of that good neighborliness, how do we make good trouble? How do we agitate? How do we take Romans 13 and put our shoulders to the levers that are going to change the way humanity has the habit of hurting itself and hurting the world around us? And how do we do that in such a way that, and this is the one that gets you, that respects the dignity of every human being, because it would be so easy, and it is so easy in this volatile environment we live in, to just it those folks, those people. Anytime I hear that, my muscles in my jaw clench for despair, because the minute we those people somebody, we turn those people into the Onesimuses. Why was Onesimus a criminal? Because he stole from Philemon. What did he steal? He stole himself. Which, there's slavery in a nutshell, but he stole himself. He stole property from Philemon. He could have stolen a necklace and chain.
That's why I was wondering what did he steal, because they never mentioned it. It never occurred to me that he was a product himself. He was actually okay. Makes sense.
All right, Jonathan. All good? Everybody set? Go in peace. We'll see you next week. Bye now.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I have to say, I spent some of the